Good evening and welcome to this special meeting of the Melrose School Committee. The date is March 18, 2020. The purpose of this meeting is to interview a candidate for the position of Superintendent of Schools. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed via MHS TV, Melrose High School Television, and is being broadcast on MMTV. Our format this evening will include 2 rounds of questions. During the first round of questions, every other question will be from a set list of questions being asked of each of the 3 finalists for the position of Superintendent of Schools. During the second round of questions, every member will have the opportunity to ask a second question. Our colleague, John Obremski, has absented himself from tonight's meeting and is participating via the live stream as he has done for the past 2 evenings. Our colleague, Liz DeSelm, who is also absent, will likewise be participating via the live stream and also participating with questions telephonically. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Julie Kuchenberger. Dr. Kuchenberger is presently serving as the interim superintendent with the Hamilton Wenham Public Schools. Dr. Kuchenberger, welcome. And we're happy to afford you the opportunity for an opening statement.
Great. So thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed my last several hours here in the district and hoping my voice will stand up to the next hour or so of conversation. Just to tell those who are joining the conversation for the first time today a little bit about myself. I have a varied background from 3 different states, serving in a variety of positions, starting as a classroom teacher in New Jersey, working my way up to vice principal, principal. I was a director of curriculum, all in the same district. I spent the first 12 of my years of my career in New Jersey before transitioning to Haverhill, Massachusetts as the assistant superintendent, where I also served as the pre-K to 12 ELA supervisor, and then took on my first superintendency in Maine. And spent 3 years there before accepting the interim superintendent position in Hamilton Wenham. I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk with you about the possibility of the Melrose superintendency and to learn more from you all about your district and what you're looking for and better understand our potential fit.
Terrific. Thank you. The first question will come from our set list of questions. Again, we're asking these of each of the candidates of the finalist, indeed, for the superintendents of school position. First question, high-performing school districts typically have a high-performing superintendent school committee working relationship. From your perspective, Doctor, what are the hallmarks of such a relationship?
I think first and foremost, it comes down to relationships. So it's very important for the superintendent and the school committee to have a 2-way respect for one another, the role that the school committee plays, but also the role and the job of the superintendent to ensure that the school district is run well. So your job as school committee is to make sure that I'm running the district well. My job is to actually run the district. And so I think when we understand the separation between our roles, it allows us to work better together as a team. I also believe that really open, honest communication is essential. You have to be able to come to me with any questions that you're hearing, thoughts and wonders that you have, ideas of how we could be doing things better, and I have to be willing to hear those things, share those with the team in a positive way, and put them into action. Similarly, I should be able to come to the school committee with my concerns and share with you what's working well and where we need to improve so that when it comes time for us to set our priorities, we're all working from the same evidence and have a shared understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. With that being said, it does take time for that relationship to grow, and it does take effort for us to find our synergy in working together as a superintendent and school committee team. That's something that I have experience doing in my past 2 roles as superintendent and would be happy to provide details if you'd like.
Terrific. Thank you.
Sure.
Our next question will come from School Committee Vice Chair Margaret Driscoll.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for being here, Dr. Kuchenberger. Something in which all good leaders must be skilled is having difficult conversations without breaching confidentiality, which I'm sure you would not do. Can you please give an example of a difficult professional conversation you've had, what the results were, and your reflections following that conversation?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, this is something that we do almost daily as superintendents in a variety of different ways. And it's a skill that I keep developing over time as each conversation, requires some nuances. And thinking about a specific or difficult conversation, I think oftentimes some of the harder conversation is when someone's giving you critical feedback about either something you're really passionate about or something that you've put a lot of time and energy into. So I'm actually thinking about a conversation that was informal that turned out to be more difficult than I thought it would be. And I'll be exposing my own vulnerabilities here, so I don't mind to do that. It was a conversation I was having with my former assistant superintendent, who I view still to this day as a mentor and a colleague, and she was giving me feedback on my transition to the district in the way that I was being received and or working. And some of the things she was sharing with me were really hard to hear, and that it was about sort of the way that I was working. She said to me, superintendents aren't doers, and you're a doer. And she also shared with me that sometimes, people can't keep up with your pace of work. And I've heard various, forms of information feedback in that way toward that end. But I really wanted to make sure that I was hearing that and really unpacking it and understanding what that meant. And it's still something that I reflect on to this day in terms of, how do we really hear that critical feedback, and how do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable so that we can grow and better serve the organization that we're serving. And so I think building from that conversation, it then led to me having other conversations with folks where I was asking them to be maybe more open and honest with me than they may have been comfortable with, so that they could give me specific examples of, when was a time that you felt supported by my leadership, when was a time that I could have supported you better. But I thought that was a really important way for me to grow, and it still continues, as I said, to be something that I reflect on and think about as I'm in new situations. So it was sort of difficult in having to be on the receiving end of it, but then also having the courage to have that conversation in a productive way that honored the other person's feelings, so that they would feel safe to give me feedback, would be one example.
Thank you.
Sure.
In returning to the set list of questions, Doctor, what do you see as your greatest strength as an administrator, and how do you or would you leverage that strength, both in your present position and potentially as the next Melrose superintendent?
Sure. So I think my greatest strength is my relentless focus on equity and inclusion. This is something that I have been developing over time as I've grown myself as developing my own cultural proficiency as a leader, but it has allowed me to have the courage to advocate for things for students when I know it's right and best, even when it might result in or need to start with a really difficult, honest conversation. It's also given me the courage to be tactful in that honesty, so that when I'm asking about something I observed that maybe I thought was inequitable or unjust, in terms of like a student-teacher reaction, I'm able to rely on that core value that I hold really deeply in order to have the courage to have the conversation, but do it in a way that is tactful and supportive, and without judgment, and just acknowledging that here's the behavior that I observed, which is separate from like who the person you are. So that one strength, I think, infuses into a lot of the decisions in the way that I interact with folks.
The next question will come from Mayor Paul Broder.
Doctor, thank you for taking so much time to be with us here in Melrose. I appreciate your comments about critical feedback. We never received that here ourselves. That's a refreshing thing to hear about a little bit. But I want to talk to you about innovation and risk, which I think kind of go hand in hand.
Sure.
And I wonder, we live in a state, an environment that is fairly highly regulated. There's a lot of high stakes testing. There is a fairly aggressive teacher evaluation regime.
Mm-hmm.
And my concern is that becomes a little bit of a roadblock to innovation and discourages risk. I'm wondering if you could give us your perspective on how to in a state like Massachusetts, in a district like Melrose, how can we encourage that risk-taking and innovation and support folks recognizing that it might not always work out?
So I think, and maybe you've done this, but as a school committee, making a really bold statement to the staff that says, we encourage you to take risks and we have your back. Like, if it doesn't work, that's okay, we have your back. And then that message, sort of trickling down from the superintendent to the leadership team and the leadership team to their teachers. But I think people will take risks if they know they have support and that it's safe to take those risks. And even when you say that, people will still be skeptical, and they'll need lots of encouragement. So it's then making sure that our actions support that statement and are aligned to that statement. And then I think it's about space. When I really think about the challenges that face public education, we keep adding more and more things to the instructional day. We aren't making the day longer. We aren't making the school year longer. We aren't asking teachers and paying teachers to work longer. We're just asking them to do more right within inside that same constraint. And they need space and time to be able to reflect on what just happened today and what could we do differently and how can we be more creative. So I think that kind of rethinking our systems and structures so that we can have more opportunities for teachers to, brainstorm ideas. I mean, that's hard to find the time in a day, and often cases for teachers just to say like, hey, I was thinking about this thing, let's test it out and see. And when we look at companies and organizations that have a lot high innovation, they have that autonomy, they have that agency, and they have that space to just brainstorm. So I think that's really missing in our field. But I think we can still move the needle. You guys already are doing a lot of really great progressive things as a district. It's just teachers knowing all the way up we have their backs. Sure.
And from the set list, please. What do you see, Doctor, as your biggest weakness as an administrator? And what steps have you taken, or will you, or would you take to address or compensate for that weakness?
So this is something I think about often, and I'll give you three. The first one is listening to learn, actively listening. I tend to right away want to help solve the problem and jump right into giving feedback, even when folks may not have asked for it. And so really, truly being an active listener and asking is now a time you'd like to hear some suggestions or ideas, and realizing that sometimes people just want you to listen is something I know technically, but putting it into practice, I need lots of reminders, and I appreciate when people give me that feedback. And I'm thinking about, one time when I was working with my doctoral team, my colleague said, listening isn't waiting for your turn to talk. And that just really hit me as, wait, I do that. Like I'm sometimes scripting in my mind what I want to say next. And so that's a big area of growth for me. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the second area that I'm working on, which is truly seeing myself through others' eyes and really understanding intent and impact are two different things. And so no one knows your intentions unless you tell them. And really thinking about how people are receiving my energy, my leadership style, and being responsive and adaptive based on the team that I'm working with at that time.
Very good. Thank you.
And the third one is communication, which kind of goes with all of that. I just think that we could always communicate better. And I talked a little bit about this earlier with the community forum, but really understanding how the community wants to receive information and how we're telling our story. We do a lot of great things in public school. We're not always as good as about telling the story. So that's another thing that I've been working on.
Great. Thank you for that.
Sure.
The next question will come from school committee member Jennifer McAndrew.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. This has been a great time together. The school budget and the budget process, as you know, drives and guides much of what we do in a school district. Can you discuss your experience with developing and implementing budgets?
Sure. So I love developing the budget. That might sound a little geeky, but I love the whole idea of creating a process. I like the idea of starting the conversation early, looking at lots of data to drive our decision, analyzing how did we utilize our previous year's or current year's resources, what's our plan for the rest of the year, everything about it, I see it as like a giant puzzle. And I'm constantly intrigued by different ways we can do more with the resources that we have. I think that oftentimes people think that you need more money to serve students better, and I've seen it go both ways. I think you need an adequate amount of funding in order to serve students well, but we also need to be really critical of how we're using those resources and communicating and articulating really well what's the return on investment. How are we going to know that this new position is actually accomplishing the goals that we've set? And so in order for that to happen, I believe it needs to be a really collaborative, transparent process. The full leadership team needs to be involved. My third year in Scarborough, we also included teacher voice in that process. The business manager and I made ourselves available after the tentative budget was prepared to go, actually before, in December, to just make ourselves available during lunch. We brought cookies and just let people talk to us about what, how are the current resources meeting your needs? What do you need more of? Where do you think we could be more efficient? And that was some really, really powerful feedback, and it allowed us, when we were communicating out the budget needs, what was in the budget and what was not, to be really specific and say, our teachers are asking for this, and that really motivated community members to come out and support the budget. So I love everything about it. I love the analytical part of it, the process, the communication piece of it, and then how do we break down something really complex in a variety of ways so that it's accessible by all members of the community. Sure.
And back to the set list of questions. You talked a bit about a difficult conversation. If you would, Doctor, please identify an unpopular decision that you've made in your professional life and describe the circumstances, if you would. For example, why you made the decision, whether you anticipated its unpopularity, how you dealt with the unpopularity, and whether you would make the same decision again given the same circumstances.
Sure. So the decision I'm thinking about was our decision in Scarborough to transition from a traditional grading system, a 100-point grading scale, traditional GPA, to a more proficiency-based system. And I think we really mashed up proficiency-based learning with grading and reporting in a way that made it very confusing for parents, and then frankly caused them to really reject the notion of proficiency-based education, when in fact what I learned through many conversations was it was the grading system that they weren't confident in. And so I feel good about the process that was in place to get to that point. Again, this was work that had been going on prior to my arrival. The middle school was a little bit ahead of the high school. They were ready to transition, to a 1 to 4 scale. The high school, not so much. They felt like the stakes were higher. We heard those concerns. We created a committee that consisted of teachers, the union president, the director of curriculum. It was facilitated by the high school's improvement strategist type of position it was like a consultant that worked with the high school specifically to work on proficiency-based education. She was hired before I arrived. She was the facilitator. We had a very balanced consensus process. It was really important to me that no voice in the room should be more important than the other. So even though I, as superintendent, was sitting at the table, the teacher sitting next to me had equal voice. And we had principals and the assistant superintendent, director of curriculum, director of special services, as you would expect. We made some really tough decisions about, what were sort of the non-negotiables, where were we going to be tight on things, where was the choice. We thought this process was so great, let's roll it out to the whole staff. But it wasn't received in the same way by staff and therefore parents. And many parents felt like we were experimenting with their children's future, which was really hard feedback to hear, but very real and emotional for them. And so if I could go back and do it over again, I think we would have brought the parents in the conversation earlier on. We would have waited to shift the grading and reporting and just focused on the pedagogy and the day-to-day instructional practices before we went to the very emotional, very kind of traditional grading adjustments. So I think in our attempt to meet the deadlines of the law, we went to the wrong place first. And then, like 2 weeks later, after we started getting a lot of really public feedback, negative pushback from parents, the state sort of redacted the whole thing. So it was really hard. I think we would have been better to go slower than trying to hurry up and meet what we interpreted to be the requirements of the law.
Very good. Thank you.
Sure.
The next question comes from school committee member Jennifer Razzie Thomas.
Hi. So I wanted to ask you a question about special education. Within your roles over time, I want to know how you come to make decisions regarding the safety of all children versus the mandate of a least restrictive setting for each student. And then kind of just give us some examples of how you weigh decisions for what individual students need and what parents are advocating for versus financial concerns. And then if you can come up with a couple of examples, obviously without names and protecting confidentiality.
I'm just jotting this, so I want to make sure I answer each part. So kind of the balance of student needs and safety, financial concerns, and then an example.
Yes, and also the push of least restrictive setting as well.
Sure. So as the law states, I believe deeply that all students should have access to the least restrictive, I would add most appropriate environment. And so it's our job as educators to understand what that looks like for each and every child individually. And so what we're noticing in public education is we have more and more students coming to school struggling with self-regulation, struggling with the ability to control their own behavior and their own body. I think there's a variety of reasons why that's happening, but the reality is that is happening, and it's across the board. And I've been seeing this as a pattern on the rise over the last 5 to 10 years, significantly much more. When I started my career, I started as an inclusion teacher. I was the general ed inclusion teacher. I co-taught for my entire career in the classroom, and students had varying needs, but not the intense behavior needs that we're experiencing today. So the financial concern, I think we can simplify this for people. The reality is that we have two choices when it comes to special ed, special education. We can either create the program within our district, or we have to locate the program. Almost always it's more cost effective for us to create the program in our district. But it's not so much as just creating the program, it's then ensuring that we have the properly trained staff, the proper support, and then the ongoing job embedded training that it's going to take to make sure that all of the adults that the students are interacting with understand what their needs are, understand how to meet their modifications and accommodations, and have had time to process, how to best support each individual student. In public education, we don't always give ourselves that time that I was talking about. So I think that's one of our challenges. In terms of an example, I'm thinking about a particular student when I was a principal. This student had some very intense behaviors. He was a bolter, so he would run faster than all of us. He was quite tall for a second grader and had really long limbs, and so there were times when because he was hurting himself or destroying property or a threat to others, he would have to be physically restrained. And it took us some time to figure out how to best meet his needs in the classroom setting. As a principal, I changed my whole wardrobe. I no longer wore earrings. I wore sneakers every day. I made sure that I didn't have loose clothing, because if I was the one who was interacting with him, oftentimes I would be injured or something could happen to a staff member who was trying to keep him safe. And in the moment when he was having these challenging behavioral episodes, if you will, he was like a totally different kid, right? And so this was like so powerful, such a powerful learning experience for me, because I was seeing firsthand kind of almost like he turned into a different person. And then once he was de-escalated and once he was safe again, he would go back to being the awesome, fun-loving kid that he wanted to be. And it became very clear to me that this wasn't a choice. Like, he wasn't choosing. He wasn't waking up in the morning and saying, how can I ruin my teacher's day? Or how can I hurt myself or my classmates? There were other things that were triggering his behavior. And so we had to work really closely with a board-certified behavior analyst to study his behavior and realize what were the antecedents, what were causing him to have these maladaptive situations. And I'm grateful that the staff was willing to take the time to learn about him as a person, to learn about how their behavior was triggering his behavior, because that is often the case. And then to learn new skills and tools in order to be able to better support him. And it would have been really easy for me as a principal to say he needs to be placed out of district, he's unsafe, he's bolting. But instead, we kind of buckled down and said, how are we going to figure this out? And that's easy when you have one student, right? He was the one student at that moment that was requiring that intensive level of support. I think what we're noticing now is that that demand has increased. And so we have more and more students in our schools, maybe not as severe as his challenges were, but they're coming to us and they have a lot of trauma, or maybe, they've had some other experiences that are influencing that behavior. And what I always try to remind folks is that, A, no student comes to school wanting to behave that way. B, we have to always ask ourselves why. Like, what is the reason behind that? And then as the superintendent, it's my job and the principal's job to make sure that the teachers have the supports they need, because no teacher wants to not be able to support a kid. And so that takes resources, that takes time, that takes patience, but I think it's worth it. Then kids get to be in their home district. They get to be with their friends who live in their community, and they get to receive that least restrictive, most appropriate education. Sure.
And returning to the set list, and yes, I am trying to break the world record for saying the word set list over and over again. I think I'm the current holder of that record. Doctor, in your opinion, how does an effective superintendent generate and or sustain trust in their school system on the part of a school community? Please provide an example of work you have done in your career to date to generate community trust in your school system.
Sure. So I think trust comes from a concerted effort to build relationships and honesty. And so it's not, I'd like to assume that everyone will trust until given a reason not to, but depending on the, previous experiences or previous relationships, in some cases when you're transitioning to a new district, there's some repair to be done. And so in my experience, that has been the case. And I've had opportunities to, and again, this goes back to why it's so important to really listen and learn as you enter into a new district, because you need to hear those stories and understand, okay, that's where this relationship was, and then think about what's it going to take to get us to a place where we have trust, mutual trust, and credibility for one another, right? Depending on what our roles are, whether that's superintendent to teacher or superintendent to mayor, superintendent to public safety. There's a lot of relationships to build, and the success of the district really relies on the ability for all of those stakeholders to trust the superintendent in a lot of ways. Particularly if I'm the one messaging budget needs, or I'm the one messaging large transformational shifts within the organization. So I think it's honesty, first and foremost, transparency, being willing to, admit when you've made a mistake or when you missed the mark. So that humility, I think, is really important. And then making evidence-based decisions so that people can see that this isn't just your great idea you cooked up in the night, that there's actually some proven evidence behind it, and or you've thought really deeply about whatever the ask is or whatever the decision is that you're trying to make. And so a real life example, when I was transitioning to one district, I was meeting with the public safety folks, and I asked very, like I like to ask anytime I'm new somewhere, is what can I do? Like, what's your what advice do you have for me so I can be most successful as the superintendent here and serving our students? And those were the 2 words I was told: be honest. And so that really stuck with me. And I try to make sure that I'm always being open and honest and vulnerable, admitting when I don't know the answer, not feeling like I have to be the keeper of all the knowledge or have everything figured out.
Very good. Thank you for that. The next question will come telephonically from school committee member Lisbeth DeSelm.
Good evening, Dr. Kuchenberger. You spoke earlier about your love of doing budgets. We have a history here in Melrose of doing more with less. In your review of Melrose Public Schools and with your experiences in your previous positions, what creativity would you bring to augment and foster this approach? And please share an example where you have done this in an academic setting.
Could you hear her?
I think so. I'll just repeat the question and make sure I'm capturing all the parts. I believe it was here in Melrose, we have a tradition of doing more with less. And so what creativity will I bring to the budget development process, and give a specific example? Is that about it? Okay. So I have, in my research of the district and the community, I have noticed that you are doing a lot with little. I've noticed that your pure people spending is below the state average, at least based on the most recent data available on the DESE website. That intrigues me. I say this to my current community, and I said this to my past community. I want to be the superintendent who is meeting the needs of all students and spending the least amount of money, so long as the staff are feeling supported and we continually grow. I think it's really important for us to understand all of the pressures around the fiscal reality in our community. Who's on fixed incomes, who's living in poverty, who might need supplemental support through maybe senior tax relief and things like that. And I think I'm really well positioned as a superintendent to be able to understand all of those external pressures while also understanding the internal pressures. What is it that our staff needs to feel efficacious every day? How do we address the changing needs of our students? How do we address the shifting needs of our population? And so that means we have to be looking at a lot of data all the time. And we have to back up our smart thinking with evidence. So in terms of creativity, I don't know just yet, but I'm sure that there will be some once I'm able to really dig into the budget and look at our data and gather more information about what's working well and where we could improve. I don't know that this is a creative example, but I'll give you one example. And this really comes from just, really understanding the budget line by line and how we're spending every single dollar, which is something I like to do. In my current district, we were providing, and I shared this with either the teachers or the administrators earlier today, but we were providing some of that BCBA service to our elementary schools. We were using a contracted service from outside of the district as a cost-saving measure. We were contracting for 19 hours a week, and it was costing us anywhere from $130 to $180 per hour. And when I started calculating that times X number of school weeks and looking at the need that was being unmet and the need that was being met, and realizing that we could double service hours by hiring our own person. They become part of our team. We provide better and more direct services to students, and we'd also be able to provide some proactive support to our teachers who are trying to navigate these maladapted and unexpected behaviors on a daily basis. And it would cost us $16,000 less. So I don't think that's innovation necessarily. I think that's just basic math. But having that critical lens and, asking questions about everything, all of that we're doing and why we're doing it can lead to, I think, more efficient and effective solutions, much like that one.
Very good.
Sure.
And the last question of round one will come from the set list, and this is our last question from the set list. Talk to us, please, Doctor, a bit more about your approach to communication with the school committee, with the district's administrators, with the faculty and staff, and importantly, with the community at large, including non-parent residents and members of the local business community.
Sure. So, of course, given our current situation with COVID-19 response, all of that is evolving and changing and shifting in a lot of different ways. But in more traditional times, my approach internally with the leadership team is to have biweekly meetings. We create a shared agenda. We have a lot of face-to-face conversation as a whole team, just making sure we're on the same page. Then on alternating weeks, I meet with the executive leadership team in a very similar way, a little more relaxed because there's fewer of us type of agenda style. But it's a lot of two-way, face-to-face communication internally, really relying on principals to kind of be the voice of their teachers to the leadership team, and then thinking as an executive leadership team, how do we make sure we're not all pulling the principals in 1,000 different directions? So there's that like internal communication, trying to refrain from email after email after email, because I think that we can all get really bogged down. And if principals and directors are sitting at their desks answering emails, then that means they're not in classroom with kids and teachers where they need to be. So that's the internal strategy. Externally, in my current district, every principal has like a weekly communication that goes home. And so knowing that, I've tried to think, well, what's my role in communicating? I'd love to be the one telling the fun stories about what's happening in school and sharing all of the successes, but they kind of have that covered. So I've tried to use more my communication with the whole family, which comes through our Blackboard Connect system, to be more of like a monthly kind of timely update, need to know information, introducing new staff, making sure everyone knows who's all the new faces in central office, because we had a lot of transition. And then I've been using the district Twitter account as well. In my past district, or let me continue on so then with elected officials, it's the same sort of thing. I try to work really closely with I have a town manager in one town and a town administrator in the other, to make sure that when I'm sending a whole communication out, they know what's going on. When we're canceling school, they know what's going on. So we communicate in a variety of ways. Some is face-to-face, some is just text messaging. Others, we've been sending some joint press releases recently. They have a PR firm that they're working with, so we're thinking about how do we share services in that way. And then trying to get some positive headlines in the press. So we've had a couple of good headlines in the short time that I've been there, but I think we could really be telling our story better moving forward. In my past district, after really all of, I will say, the crisis that occurred in the spring of 2018, we took a look at the power that social media played in that situation, and it really fed a lot of negativity. And so I think the easy thing would have been for us to say, like, let's shut down social media. We had a Twitter page and we had a Facebook page that was very active in that communication. But when I stood back and I reflected on, what worked, what could we do better within the context of all of those things that were happening, I realized, what a powerful tool social media can be if we channel it in a positive way. And one of the things as a leadership team we started saying is that these headlines don't match what's happening. Like, the media is really sensationalizing. This is a hard time for all of us, but they're telling the story in a way that's not accurate. And we kind of looked around and we were like, yeah, but we're not, if they're going to tell the story if we're not. And so we kept talking about, like, how do we tell our story better? How do we control the narrative as a district and a team? So I formed a key communicator team, and we started we actually added Instagram, and then we opened up our access to our social media accounts so that our instructional coaches could also be tweeting out things. And we tried to have a goal of everyday evidence. So we set like a micro goal, like by November, I think it was like November 15th, could every instructional coach post at least one thing? And then when we did that and it got lots of positive feedback, we started saying, can we post something every day? Who else? Then teachers started sending things to them. And we really, I think, turned the page around sort of some of the negativity that was surrounding the district unfairly, and got really good at telling our story, which then changed the way, like even at school committee meetings, I started doing a PowerPoint for every meeting, and our student reps jumped on board, and they started adding videos, like upstaging us, adding videos of different cool things that were happening in our schools, inviting clubs to come and speak. And so we really just try to focus, like, there's so many great things going on here. Let's tell our story better. And that's a lesson that has stuck with me. And I think as schools, we can always grow in that area.
Very good. Thank
Sure.
you for that. And that completes round one. Is there any desire or need for a break among the members or you, Doctor?
Nope, I'm good.
We good? We move on. Round two begins with a question from yours truly, if I may. Doctor, could you talk to us a bit about your collective bargaining experience and your approach to labor management relations?
Sure. So in my current district, all of our contracts are about to expire in June. And so one of the things I have, in light of just some of the different things that have been happening across the state with bargaining, got them thinking about what's going to be your approach to negotiations. Previously, they weren't really sitting at the table as a school committee. That authority had been delegated to the past superintendent and assistant superintendent, and they were wanting to now be back at the table and owning that process a bit more. So we've been using this time to prepare and for them to learn, about the contract. So we started meeting, I think our first meeting was in January, and now the subcommittee's meeting every Tuesday throughout, leading up to the fall when we anticipate, the initial letter from the teachers union. Typically they negotiate first. But we started looking at, what's working in this contract, and I've had the principals thinking the same way, where's some of the language that has tripped us up this year, or it's less clear than we would like it to be, and making note of that so that we can clarify that in the next round of negotiations. And then in preparation, working with our new HR administrator to start gathering some data, our human resources data, so that they can really understand who are our 308 employees, what steps are they on, how many years of experience do they have, how many years of education do they have, how many are near retirement or closing in on retirement based on maximum benefits. Then also looking at what are some of the competitors in our area, if you will? What are their salary scales looking like? What are some things that they're negotiating? So trying to give them that evidence to get them ready so that they don't feel so that they can feel really prepared when they enter into those conversations. Has been really my strategy currently. In my past district, the contract had just been negotiated when I arrived, and it was a big adjustment because the teachers were significantly underpaid in the region, and they had a set number of districts that they compared themselves to regularly. And when we looked at that cohort, they were grossly underpaid, and so they had a step. Obviously a step increase, a cost of living adjustment, and a parity adjustment that was meant to kind of bump them up and level the playing field, if you will, make us more competitive for recruitment and retention. So that was all finished before I arrived, but I devoted a lot of energy into studying it deeply and creating a collective bargaining analysis so that the community could understand what was in this contract and why it was a good thing. And I supported that with evidence around the critical teacher shortage that we are on the cusp of experiencing, probably last in mass, but already we were feeling it in Maine, and helping people understand that less and less people are even going into education. And so I communicated that with the community. Also, talking to them about career phases and where people were and what the contract was going to cost us over time, because we had a very organized concerned taxpayer group that was in their own blog kind of criticizing the school committee for the agreement that they had created, and tried to just be an advocate for it, really. So those have been my two most recent experience. Of course, I've had other experiences as a principal and assistant superintendent as well.
Very good. Thank
Sure.
you. The next question will come from Ms. Driscoll.
Thank you. Our early childhood center is a shining star in our district. Can you please speak to your experience in early ed and how you might support our ECC's curriculum alignment, inclusion, and standards of excellence?
Sure. So another reason why I'm interested in Melrose is just knowing that you have an early childhood center and that you're focusing on our youngest learners, as I believe that that is the best, wisest, smartest investment that we can make. Not to say that the rest of the work that we do, K through 12, doesn't also matter, but we know that when we're talking about return on investment, when we're talking about lifetime success, that early intervention is so critical. And the data is really clear. When we look at every dollar we spend in preschool with our 3 and 4-year-olds, the return on investment is like $8.97 or something like that. I should probably adjust that for inflation or not, given our current situation. But then when we start to look at students who are experiencing poverty, or students who have developmental delays, or students who have experienced trauma, that return on investment can be anywhere from $23 to $30. So it just makes good sense, right? And I think getting them at 3 is good. I wish we could have them at birth in some situations, but we also know that the growth that happens in the brain from 3 to 5 years, well, really 0 to 5, is so rapid. Like, you're never able to learn as much in your lifetime as you are at that early stage of development. And so, again, getting them into really well-programmed, nurturing environments is going to help them for life. In terms of the curriculum, I think having a balance of structure and play is really important. Making sure, first and foremost, that they feel loved and safe in that environment. And then my favorite part about that age level is the ongoing negotiations that occur between the children and the teacher with the children, and the coaching that the early childhood educators do. Again, that language development, that compassion and empathy that you can foster from that early age is really powerful and dynamic. And so thinking in balance, making sure that it's a really hands-on, learner-centered type of program is important to me. I would be sad to see little people doing worksheets every day. I think there's not really any need for that at that age level, but lots of materials, lots of sensory integration, lots of occupational and physical types of therapies for all kids is a wise and smart investment. And they're so cute. That too, right? The things they say.
Indeed. The next question comes from Mayor Broder, please.
Doctor, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to try to get away with 2 questions and pretend that they're pretty related.
Okay, I won't tell.
I'm very interested in student voice. You touched on it a little bit when you talked about some of the interaction with the student reps on the school committee and some of the way I think you said they kind of took over the process a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's awesome, and I love to see that. We have some of that in the district, but a lot of that goes to kids that are maybe naturally inclined to do that, that have that energy or interest in performing or getting engaged, taking a leadership position. But I'm interested in how we can expand that, how we can reach kids and hear from them, have them take ownership of their education and the way the district is run that might not always have that opportunity. And the second question or the second part of that is, I think it might be easier for a teacher to do that than the leader of the district, given their closeness to the students. So I'm wondering if you miss the classroom.
Every day, if I'm honest, I do miss the classroom. The relationships, just the way you get to know your students, that it's something that I miss every day, if I'm being honest. What's great now is that I have students who I taught in kindergarten, first grade, third grade, who are finding me on Facebook and saying, "Oh, Miss Fluette, you're a superintendent," and telling me about their lives and telling me where they are in their lives. And I've really enjoyed that aspect and realizing, really, we say this all the time about teachers, but teachers really do make a lifelong impact on kids. And so, to that end, as superintendent, I am really passionate about connecting directly with students. And I could give a couple examples of that, but I think the simple answer is, how do we find out? We just ask. I think a lot of times adults like to overcomplicate things and then take a really long time to come up with solutions. And what I have found in the various ways that I've been able to work directly with students is that we're really just in their way. And so empowering them to be leaders and giving them access to, district staff to be able to make decisions, they'll do it. And so I'm thinking of a couple of different examples. I talked earlier with the community about a recycling program and the way that we have, this is the table. It's myself, the superintendent, the director of facilities, an elementary principal, the middle school principal, 2 teachers. One is the pre-K, the K-12 wellness teacher. The other one is a media specialist in charge of the collaboratory. They also have access to the business office, and we're sitting there at the table with them, and parents are on this team too. And this is our Hamilton Wenham Goes Green. We're trying to become a zero waste community. The kids are really pushing us. We had one meeting that was 1 hour, and at the second meeting they were like, we're not getting anything done. We really need to start moving on some of this stuff, which was like so awesome, right? And every time I would be like, I had to be like, the agenda, we're going to stick to the agenda, because they'd be like, and then we should do this, and then we should do that. And it's so glaringly obvious that they have the energy and the passion, and all of our kind of bureaucracy gets in the way of that. So we've been challenged by that, and they're really helping us move at a pace that is visible and you can see. And there's been a number of things that have happened and been implemented now that we've had 4 meetings. We got rid of plastic bottles at the high school, and we're using compostable boxed water. We replaced a water filter, that fillable station that was like rusty and gross, and they were like, nobody will use it, so we're just filling our bottles with plastic bottles. We also started at the middle school and high school. I don't know if you've heard of these like bottle bricks, where you take all of your kind of like granola bar wrappers and, snack bag wrappers, and you stuff them into these plastic bottles, and you have to like shove them down with this stick, but this guy is like literally building structures out of them. And then the middle school is collecting the little ones, and they're going to try to build some furniture out of them. And we also renegotiated our waste contract because we were recycling, but not really. So when we started really looking at the data behind that, and they knew it, like the kids all knew it. They're like, yeah, we know there's a recycle bin in every classroom, but we also see the custodians just dumping it into the trash bin. And so we looked into it, and they were right. So all of those things have happened from 4 one-hour meetings with students. These are students that obviously have a passion, and so we're trying to help them have real ways to apply that passion and see. Like I said to the director of facilities after the second meeting, we better start delivering, or else they're going to lose interest. So that's one example. But in terms of the kids and these are kids who I would say they were going to run the world no matter what, right? They're very driven young women, all, which I think is interesting too. But in my previous district, when we were developing our Reducing Sexism and Violence program, we really tried to think about students who are known influencers, but also who are the students who have the potential to influence and maybe have not yet had that opportunity. Who are the students who aren't yet connected in some way to a sport or a club or an extracurricular activity? Could this be a leadership opportunity for them? And we relied on our teachers to help us sort of identify who those kids might be, but really intentionally saying, we know that, some of our kids are always going to be involved. How do we create more opportunities for others who may be more introverted or don't know how to access those opportunities?
Thank you.
Sure.
Ms. McAndrew, please.
Thank you. So Melrose has a highly valued MATCO program, and I'm interested in your own experience with or knowledge of the MATCO program and with supporting students and families in MATCO or programs like MATCO in other places that you've been.
Sure. So I have no direct experience with MATCO yet, but I do have colleagues who have worked in districts where they do have MATCO partnerships and have learned sort of through them some of the challenges that can occur. I think in theory, everyone supports the theory and everyone wants to create as many opportunities as we can for kids, but then there's some other things that you have to be really thoughtful of around sort of integration, cultural norms, access, transportation, things like that, that require more time and attention. And so it's a program that I believe in deeply, and I'm excited to learn more about what's working well with it here. But I could imagine that there's also some challenges that likely have been addressed or that the district's trying to address. Sure.
The next question comes from Ms. Razzie Thomas, please.
So this is a question about teaching and learning as the leader for the district. We've heard a lot about how you use data to inform decisions, but I'm curious about how you would measure outcomes, and how I want you to kind of take us through your thinking based on two different examples that I'll give you.
Okay.
So it's really about what do you value and what are the outcomes that you're shooting for as a superintendent and the leader of teaching and learning for the district. So in this coming year at the high school, Melrose High School, the freshmen will be entering in, and they will have a few unleveled classes: English, history, and languages. So how would you measure over the let's say the next 3 to 5 years? They're doing this for equity reasons, and how would you measure whether this academic shift is a success or a failure to all students, or to each student, really? That's one example. If you want to answer that, I'll give you the next. Well, let me do this all at once because I'm not
Okay.
supposed to ask you any follow-up
Okay.
questions. The other example that I'd like you to think about and explain your thinking about outcomes is that you've heard a lot about our district moving towards personalized learning and competency-based education. And how do you see the importance of choice and student engagement, along with how do you keep rigor and standards and high standards up? So how do you kind of be innovative and allow for student voice and choice, but also maintain a high level of academic excellence?
Sure. So let me just write that down so I don't forget. The first thing I would say is that in my experience, when we give students more agency and opportunity, they most always exceed our expectations. So I think the idea of unleveling, if the intent behind that is to not pigeonhole kids to a certain pathway that may be less challenging than the unleveling option, I would fully support that. My hope would be that we've gathered some good baseline data from the past couple of years, or we can go back and gather that data to look and see how did students perform, how have students historically performed pre-unleveling. And then, of course, to be collecting that data along the way, and the data can look like a lot of different things. Ideally, it would be crystallized in the form that we wouldn't be relying on any one source, but maybe we're looking at course grades, maybe we're looking at benchmarks or midterms and finals, depending what the assessment structure currently is and has been, then also over time, seeing how well those students perform in other courses. So following the cohort, if you will. And I think there's a couple of different ways we can always look at student data. Of course, we can look at ourselves, compare ourselves to ourselves. And so when we do that, we're looking at how typically did ninth graders perform? Is this a specific content area or all that you're unleveling?
And languages.
Okay, so how did students, ninth graders typically, perform? Are these ninth graders now in an unleveled course outperforming them or not? Following, kind of those ninth graders and previous students who were in the unleveled, how did they perform over the course of their 4 years here? And then also looking at other districts that are leveling versus unleveling. So comparing ourselves to others and saying, how are our students performing comparatively? And so the MCAS is good for that because they all take the same MCAS in 10th grade. We can use that as one measure, but those internal benchmarks as well. And student feedback, asking students. Let's talk to some students who were in the unleveled experience. Let's do a survey that's anonymous and design some questions that are unbiased, but yet give us information about their experience. And then let's ask the students who are experiencing it in an unleveled way and hearing from them what worked and what didn't work. I think also asking the teachers too, because unleveling, this is sort of like adopting a policy, right? That's the easy part. Now we have to implement it. So making sure that the teachers who are being asked to change the way they're approaching the curriculum or the course or content have support in place while they're doing it, before, during, and after, I think is also really important. So the same would be true with personalized learning. I think that, again, getting regular feedback from students and staff about what's working and what's not is an important measure, in addition to some of the more concrete, test scores and or benchmark assessments. I believe your question was about concern about rigor.
Yeah.
How do we maintain the rigor? Well, when you set your own goals and you learn, hopefully early on, but it's not too late, right? We're all still learning how to be good goal setters. When you set your own goals and then you monitor your goals along the way, I don't know about you, but the next thing I want to do is set another goal. And so that affirmation of knowing that you're making progress, that motivation, can be really powerful for kids. And so again, I think we need to trust that they want to be the best they can be. And if we create the conditions where they have more choice and they're following their passions and their pathway is more personalized, so long as they're hitting those standard measures of progress or proficiency, I think that you will see kids exceed your expectations, or our expectations. So again, I think we just have to have those measures in place, and using sort of like an improvement science mindset. So we have a plan. I'm sure that it's been tested. We're now going to implement the plan. We're going to collect data along the way. We're going to study that plan or study that data, and we're either going to iterate the plan, abort the plan, adjust the plan, or take the next step. So that's all part of that sort of improvement science mindset. Sure.
And the last question this evening comes to us telephonically from Miss DeSelm.
Hi. Final question of the evening. You must be quite relieved that this is coming to a head. The field of education is constantly changing. What is one recent trend that you think will have a major influence on Melrose Public Schools, if not all school districts, in the years to come? And how would you prepare the district, the staff, and the community for this trend?
Well, I think we're about to find out, right? I think that what's happening right now with COVID-19 and all of our families being home and us as educators trying to figure out how to really truly provide authentic, engaging, meaningful distance enrichment activities through distance learning has the potential to really revolutionize everything that we do. I think we're about to experience a ton of innovation, a ton of creativity, and much like 9/11 influenced the way we travel now, I think that this global pandemic is going to change the way we think about teaching and learning, where learning happens, what learning is, why, how do we know students are learning, and what kind of tools and structures do we need to have in place so we can be really flexible and responsive. So I guess I'm saying to be continued, because I think that this right now, what's happening, is going to really change the way we do school.
Very good. And Doctor, we're happy to afford you the opportunity of a closing statement.
Sure. I'm forgetting what I've said and not said at this point, but I want to start by just saying thank you. I'm so impressed by the engagement of the community. I must have had almost every administrator on the call this morning. There were 24 teachers or 20 teachers on the call this afternoon. I'm not sure how many community members were engaging, but I think you said. And so with all of our competing priorities, with everything that we're managing, I know it was a challenge for me to switch my brain and kind of put my distractions aside to be fully present here. And I just am so grateful that people in the Melrose community were able to prioritize this process and do the same. So I'm gracious for that. I also just want to remind you that of my experiences. You've heard me talk about it in a couple of different ways. I really am excited about the work that you're doing. I understand that it was a big lift to get to where you are, and I would be honored to be able to come in and learn about your district and help you maintain that momentum so that you can continue to meet the needs of all learners and show that steady progress and growth that you've been showing over the last several years.
Very good. Well, on behalf of the committee, thank you very much. We know it's been a long day. You've had nearly 7 hours of nonstop talking and fairly close scrutiny, and we certainly and we certainly appreciate your interest and your investment of time, energy, and effort. And thanks to all of you at home for watching and engaging in this process. The school committee does have a bit of housekeeping. We do have need for an executive session this evening for the following noticed purpose: to conduct a strategy session in preparation for negotiations with non-union personnel. And for the record, we will not be returning to public session. Is there a motion to adjourn to executive session? Made by Ms. Driscoll, seconded by Mayor Broder. And I will call the roll. Ms. McAndrew? Yes. Ms. Razzie Thomas?
Yes.
Ms. DeSelm?
Yes.
Ms. Driscoll?
Yes.
Mayor Broder?
Yes.
And Mr. O'Connell, yes. And that motion to adjourn to executive session passes with 6 in favor and 1 absent, and we are so adjourned. Thank you again, Doctor.